One thing I do like to ask patients and discuss with them is, when were you last well? Because a lot of patients can pick out a time when things may be shifted. So for example, say someone went on a camping trip and they came back with a bullseye rash, and that's when they knew that the fatigue started then. So maybe we start thinking Lyme disease infections, things like that. And I encourage patients to dig deep and really reflect back to, when were they last well? What shifts happened at that time? And you may be able to figure out for yourself, okay, this is what I was doing that kind of made that difference.
Do you find yourself tired even after a long night of sleep? Do you feel like you're always running on empty? If you resonate with these questions, you won't want to miss today's conversation with our amazing integrative and functional physician assistant, EJ Meaney. I am Dr. Andrew Wong, co-founder of Capital Integrative Health. This is a podcast dedicated to transforming the consciousness around what it means to be healthy and understanding and exploring the root causes of both disease and wellness. Today's guest, EJ, was inspired to practice as a holistic provider that combines the best of conventional and integrative care after watching those close to her transform their own health by supporting their body's own innate healing powers. EJ practices integrative primary care and functional medicine in our clinic at Capital Integrative Health and supports our patients in addressing conditions including fatigue, hormone imbalance, detox issues, irritable bowel syndrome, and much more. Join us today for a deep dive conversation about fatigue and what you can do to get your energy back again. Welcome, EJ, to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.
So, EJ, you've been at the practice for 2 years now, providing integrative primary care, doing an amazing job. And for those who may not be familiar with your story, would you mind telling us about what motivated you to get into integrative health?
Yeah, definitely. So my experience with integrative medicine definitely started when I was pretty young. My family kind of ingrained to me that sleep, nutrition, other lifestyle factors were synonymous with health. I was thinking about this question, and my parents, when we were younger, they used to take nori and roasted pumpkin seeds, and they'd wrap the nori up like a cone and put the pumpkin seeds in it, called it ice cream cones. So growing up, those were the ice cream cones
Sounds
that we
delicious.
had. Yes, it is really good, actually. But what motivated me to, kind of get into more integrative medicine, when I was in PA school, is kind of when I first started to realize, before my experience was hospital, emergency-based medicine, so I thought naturally that's where I was headed. But I will never forget sitting in pharmacology, learning about hyperlipidemia, talking about statins, and, it was, the numbers are this level, you prescribe statins, and I remember at that point being like, there's got to be more. There has to be more to this. So that's when I really started exploring, looking for an integrative practice. And by an amazing series of events, I ended up here at Capital Integrative Health.
Yes, we're so happy to have you here. Yes. And definitely medicine is more than algorithms and thinking inside the box. There's some room for that, but certainly there's a lot of room outside of that box too.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of a wider, net of treatment and options and things. So today, speaking of big topics, we want to talk about a big topic today that many people struggle with, which is fatigue. People are kind of coming into our clinic, and we see people that even after like a couple cups of coffee, they're like, oh, I feel really tired still, or 8 hours of sleep, still tired.
Yes.
How often do you see patients with fatigue, and what are some of the classic signs that you find?
Yeah, so this fatigue is really common. I think anyone you talk to has experienced fatigue at some point in their lives, whether this is something acute or more chronic that they're dealing with. And as a clinician, fatigue can be a really difficult diagnosis, and I think as a patient can also be really frustrating. So it's really important to find a provider who's ready to work with you to really dig deep and understand what's going on and what underlying causes may be impacting your fatigue. In terms of some of the classic signs, there can be a lot of different signs that present, but some of the most common, daytime sleepiness, feeling exhausted. Brain fog is one big I'll see a lot of, so either mental clarity, unable to focus at the task at hand, or just feeling scattered brain, I think would be the other thing. It can present as muscle pain, joint pain, inability to recover from exercise, things like that. One thing that I wanted to say, though, is the symptom that occurs, so fatigue, is a sign to us. It's a sign to our body that something's not right, and we need to honor that. So, say that your body is fighting a chronic infection, something like Lyme. Your body is going to use fatigue as a sign that you need to slow down because it's trying to protect the immune system. So really listening to our bodies is key during this time.
So fatigue is something that is a symptom, and as you said, there's many root causes, many lifestyle factors, many underlying causes as well, besides lifestyle. But it sounds like if we honor our bodies and listen to our bodies, then we can slow down and really allow our bodies to heal.
Yeah, it's such a big part. And in today's world, that is, I think, one of the hardest things in having that conversation with patients, because our lives are so go, go, go. But maybe what our body needs in that moment is really that slow down moment.
Yeah, I wonder if, too, it's kind of like if we're on the highway and it's like 55 miles an hour or 65 or 70, you know, and then our body's saying, oh, you need to go down to 25, but we're on this like 70-mile-per-hour lane.
Everything's moving that
Everything's moving that fast, you know.
Absolutely.
How do you advise patients to kind of slow down and, you know, get off that highway onto some, you know, more natural path that's a little slower there to honor their bodies?
Yeah, absolutely. So this it's a big question. I think it's very patient specific. I love talking with patients to see, you know, where are the areas of give. So maybe that's making a chart right now of things that are giving you energy versus what is depleting you, and how can we kind of compare those things, and where can we make some adjustments in order to improve that.
That's a great idea. Yeah. And we also talk about lifestyle as a big cause of both energy and fatigue.
Yes.
Let's delve into that.
Absolutely, yes. So lifestyle is by far the fundamental thing when it comes to fatigue that I talk with patients about. So what does lifestyle include? So there's a few different things, and we'll dive into these a little bit more, but sleep, nutrition, stress management, relationships, movement, and nature are some of the big ones. One that I want to add in specifically is definitely screen time. And this has become way more of an issue, especially in the last 2 years, that more people are working from home, spending way more time behind their screens. I actually read a report that the average person spends about 8 hours behind either a phone or computer screen. So definitely, you know, if you know you're working 8 hours a day behind the computers, take those mornings and evenings away from the devices, because it'll help your health, definitely.
Yeah, so I think the idea is that when we look at screens for that long, it might be actually detrimental to our energy. Is that correct?
It is an energy drainer for several reasons. One, just the monotony of staring at this screen. It can deplete not only energy, but you can feel mood changes as well with that. Also, we know that it can impact cortisol, which is a big thing that can come into fatigue as well.
Mm-hmm. It can stress out the cortisol, the adrenal system.
Yes, exactly.
Great. And on the lifestyle factors, kind of if you would get into a little bit more of that.
Yeah, definitely. So exploring those lifestyle factors a little bit deeper, I think sleep is definitely one of the big ones. So what does the quality of your sleep look like, and are you prioritizing sleep right now?
Yeah.
If you find that you are, and there's still a lot of daytime sleepiness or fatigue, especially when you wake up, I would definitely talk with your practitioner about looking into doing a sleep study. Sleep studies can reveal a lot. Even if you're not snoring, we do find patients can still have underlying issues with sleep apnea or upper airway resistance syndrome.
Do you feel that people view sleep as a barrier to productivity and doing stuff? In other words, sometimes I wonder if people are not wanting to sleep subconsciously because there's so much on their plate and they're so focused on doing, they don't understand that sleep in and of itself is an active healing process.
Yes, it is so active. So many things are happening in your body while you sleep. To restore, specifically today talking about fatigue, your energy, those mitochondria of your cells, which we can talk a little bit more about. But yes, sleep is a very active process. So I have this conversation a lot, especially parents with young kids. They find that the night is the only time they really have for themselves. But it's really important to make it a priority. Absolutely.
Yeah. How many people do you find when you test them for sleep apnea end up having sleep apnea? We know that that's a big deal here. So
for most patients that we test, it's very rare that I see a normal test. So most patients range from somewhere from upper airway resistance syndrome to mild forms to all the way up to more severe. But a lot of times it is something that we see very commonly.
Yeah, so that's a big one. How about nutrition? How does nutrition and food play a role in energy?
Yes, yeah. So nutrition and gut health is huge. So we know that from the food that we eat, there are nutrients that we get that are really important to fuel our cells. So think of it, your cells, kind of if we make the analogy to a car, we could say you have an engine, and in that car you add gas and oil, and you do lots of maintenance to make sure that car runs well. You do regular maintenance. So I want you to think of your body in the same way, that doing that regular maintenance is really important. So in our own bodies, we have our own engines, and they're called mitochondria that live in our cells. And those mitochondria need a few different things, but one of them is the micronutrients that come from our food. So some of those may look like magnesium, your B vitamins, CoQ10, amino acids like carnitine. So the first question I always ask people, are you eating real food? What does that look like? The second part to this also is, are you absorbing the food that you're eating? So we know that there can be infections in the gut or issues with digestive capacity that can impact the ability of you to absorb and break down those nutrients.
Thank you. How about iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia? How often do you find that in your patients?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the patient, but it is something that we will commonly find. That's one of our baselines that we test for here, and often it's not something people may test for up front, but it is really important to look at because iron is really important to support the health of the cells, mitochondria, and give you energy.
So for all those listeners out there, and they say, well, what kind of EJ, what kind of diet should I be on to help my energy? What would you say to that?
Yes, absolutely. So I think real food is my biggest thing. I'm not a nutritionist by training, but what I found is that nutrition is one of the most confusing topics out there.
Yes.
And often when patients start working with me, that is one place that they find very confusing, that there's a lot of information. So I tend to tell patients, eat real food. Is this something that came from nature, or did it come from a package? Outside of that, I think balancing those macronutrients, so really focusing more on the protein and fats and maybe a little less carbohydrates. Now, this can vary patient to patient, but that's generally kind of my rule of thumb. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would add with nutrition is water intake, which we often don't think about, but getting enough water in a day is so important to properly fuel your body. So typically I tell patients half of your body weight in ounces should be your rule of thumb. A little different depending on if you're sweating, eating other foods that are high in water content.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's talk about movement a bit.
Yes.
And we can call it exercise, we can call it movement, we can call it activity. How do you feel about movement and the ability to kind of overcome fatigue with that?
Yeah, so this can be really challenging because patients with fatigue feel like it's really hard to get moving is the first part of that they don't even have the energy to get to that point. So it's really, evaluating where the patient's at and starting at that point. Movement is so essential, though, because it actually gives us energy, which we often don't think about. I am really big on movement across the entire day. So a lot of times, especially in school, we talked a lot about exercise. Are they exercising 30 to 60 minutes a day? What does that look like? But I find that patients do so much better with movement throughout the entire course of the day, and that helps them sustain good energy. So that may look like little small things, doing 50 jumping jacks or 10 squats, going out for a quick walk for a few minutes. It doesn't have to be complicated. So
don't have to dress up in fancy clothes, go to the gym, and
could
do that.
Fun. Yes, absolutely.
Would be fun, yes.
And I do like, with those things, it does create a sense of community around some relationships there, which is huge. The other thing I do want to say about exercise is that sometimes I find that patients push themselves too hard when it comes to really intense, maybe strength training or cardio exercises. So just being really in touch with your body and evaluating, is this exercise too stressful for me to do right now?
Mm-hmm. How about, what do you think about working with a trainer or physical therapist?
That's such a great idea. We're really lucky here to have Dr. Hiza, who I know has been on the podcast before. But any PT or kind of trainer is great because they'll help kind of guide what direction may be good for you, what movements may be best for your body.
So let's talk about thoughts and mindset. We know that thoughts can heal, thoughts can harm in theory. So what are your sort of feelings about thoughts in general, and then thoughts related to how that affects someone's energy?
Yeah, so absolutely. So I think just one thing to say is stress. There's no shortage of stress, and there's no way we're ever going to be able to completely avoid stress. So it all comes down to how are we going to manage that stress. And that stress may look like external things, or it may be internal things, like you said, thoughts. So my approach for this generally, I like to see one where patients are at. I think positive thinking has so many benefits in healing, especially when it comes to something that's as complex as fatigue. Patients with more positive outlook on their diagnosis and where they're headed tend to be able to stick with treatment plans better and ultimately get the results that they want. So it can be tricky. I love using all of our resources, health coaching, it may be working with some type of therapist, psychologist, social worker, to really dig deep and understand what's going on there.
Yeah, sometimes there's trauma too that could be part of that uncovered, and that could be a big impediment. And then once that's removed, that obstacle's removed, then they can kind of start their healing journey a bit more.
Absolutely.
That's great. Besides that, what other kind of root causes of fatigue would you say could be kind of giving us an overview of what you're thinking if someone's coming in?
So one more thing I wanted to say, relationship-wise, is really important for healing, especially with something with fatigue that can be really hard to get jump-started, to get into that. All of these things that we're talking about, they're hard. It's hard to make lifestyle changes. So having that accountability or that relationship is so key. And in two different ways I think about this. So one is that relationships can be either very restorative or draining. So just looking at the relationships you have right now, there are some people you hang out with and you're like, I feel motivated, I want to go out and make that change. And other people who will suck the life out of you a little bit.
Right. It's that saying, right? We are the average of the 5 people we hang out with the most. Yeah. That's kind of what it is. So, finding people in our lives that will be restorative or regenerative, with you versus like someone that's going to take away that energy. So
yeah, absolutely. And then the other part to this is the accountability. So having someone there that you can lean on to support you, to check in as you're trying to make these adjustments and changes.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we also need to talk about nature,
Yes,
the greatest healer likely is going to be getting outdoors and smelling the pine trees and watching the birds and stuff. So let's talk about nature a bit. And are we kind of suffering in our society right now from a nature deficit disorder?
Absolutely, yes. Most of us spend more time inside than we do outside. I know some patients I talk to some days don't get outside at all, which is tough. I think it comes down to a couple of different things that I think about with fatigue. So one is air quality. We know that indoor air quality is really poor in a lot of places. So getting outside, has that good oxygen, which we know we need to fuel those mitochondria that we mentioned earlier. The other piece to this is we know nature is very restorative. It releases happy hormones like dopamine that can power our brains and give us that boost that we need. And sunlight is the other big thing. So I talk a lot with patients about sleep, but sunlight is a really important part of that. So if patients are having trouble, especially falling asleep at night, I always recommend early morning sun exposure. So as you wake up in the first 30 minutes, if you can get outside, I know it's a little harder in the winter months, but get outside and expose yourself to some of that light can be so restorative.
Yeah, we've even seen good results in some of the people in those sleep group classes that we're doing with Liz.
Yeah.
And they're getting outside in the morning, they're having candlelight at dinner, and then they're feeling much better.
Yeah.
Sleeping better, having more energy as a result.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great. Let's talk about a little bit more into the functional side. Root causes of... So let's say someone's done their lifestyle, they're sleeping well, they have good relationships, have good resilience. What's going on with their energy still, and they're still having fatigue? So, say, hey, EJ, I'm still, 2 cups of coffee, doing all lifestyle things, still feeling tired. Where do you go from there?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really common. A lot of patients work really hard to get those lifestyle things in check. So first thing, which we kind of already mentioned, is the gut. So really looking deeply into the gut to see, are there any bacterial overgrowth? Is there issues with digestion, to make sure you're absorbing those nutrients? From there, the next place that I would go is looking at thyroid and adrenals, probably, which are 2 of the big culprits. So adrenals, this relates to our cortisol relating to stress. So we just talked about how important stress management is. But definitely digging deeper into this, is there dysregulation in the cortisol pattern throughout the day? Because we know that cortisol will rise into the early morning and then start to fall into the afternoon, being its lowest in the evening so that you can fall asleep. But because of the chronic stress that we've dealt with, many patients experience dysregulations in this pattern. So getting this tested, whether that's through saliva or urine or even some blood tests, can be really helpful. Yeah,
let's talk about rhythm. So we talk about circadian rhythm a lot on this podcast, and elsewhere day-night rhythms.
Yeah.
Then there's something called ultradian rhythms, which is basically the rhythm during the day that's kind of this activity and rest cycle. And I guess what I've been reading about is that we've kind of been created or built to have a certain amount of activity during the day, maybe 90 minutes, let's say,
Yeah.
and then maybe 20 minutes of rest or relatively less stressful or less busy activity. How much do you think that's playing into fatigue where, people are just kind of go the whole day and then they're exhausted in the afternoon or the evening and they're wondering why?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's so important to break up your day, kind of how you're mentioning, getting those periods of movement versus rest. I see a lot of people who kind of group everything together. So it's all the work over that 8-hour stretch, and then they'll get the movement in here. But it's really the variation there that creates the best energy reserve, I'll say, support to those mitochondria to support fatigue. The 3 p.m. crash is probably what I hear the most, is when patients are really reaching for that cup of coffee to find that extra energy. So this is really the point in time when we need to be reaching for things like the movement and the breathing, the self-care management there, because that's ultimately what's going to stimulate us, get things back on track.
Kind of like if we're having a gas pedal on at 70 miles an hour from 8 to 3 or 7 to 3 or whatever, then of course there might be some people crashing at that point.
Yeah. And we've mentioned caffeine a few times, which is interesting. I love coffee, so I'm not going to tell anyone to stop drinking coffee, but it may be exploring if caffeine is one of the big issues that may be depleting your energy. So we know that caffeine will initially give us a boost, but then once the caffeine falls off those receptors, then you can get the energy crash from that.
How many cups are you thinking, EJ? How many cups of coffee do you like to drink?
How do I?
Yes.
I'm just 1 cup, usually decaf, sometimes half and half. But I noticed that even just making that switch to decaf made a big difference for me in terms of energy. I like the taste of it. It's just purely based off my morning routine. I love that aspect of it. But in terms of relying on it for energy, I do not typically recommend. And if you are drinking caffeine, typically cutting it off 10 hours before your bedtime, even longer for patients who are caffeine sensitive.
That's good advice. Good advice. Going back to nutrition for a second, what do you think about morning snacks or afternoon snacks? If someone's needing a pick-me-up, sometimes people are getting hypoglycemic, and that might be a reason.
Yes, definitely. So especially in the afternoon hours, I find that even myself, that's when I'm reaching for more of the carbs or the sugar, the chocolate, to find that energy boost. So if you are looking to support especially blood sugar during that time, picking a snack that has, some good protein in it, some good fats, will help sustain your energy. We know, too, that balancing the meals over the course of the day, so more protein and fat compared to carbohydrates, can also help to balance that blood sugar so you don't get those crashes.
Yeah, you have more satiety and everything.
Yeah.
Great. I think we talked about screen time, quite a bit. I know you're very interested in EMFs and electromagnetic radiation and fields. So if you want to talk a little bit about that a little bit more, how much do you recommend for someone ideally, or is it like 0 screen time, which it might be hard for us all to do, but what are we thinking there?
Yeah, so I'm hoping that more studies are going to come out, especially with the amount of time we're using now. A lot of the studies that we have right now are only for a couple of hours a day assessing on wireless broadbands that we don't necessarily use anymore, things like 2G and 3G. So it's hard to know exactly, but some of the big things that they found is that our devices do raise our cortisol, and our cortisol is our stress hormone. So they can make us more stressed, which is really interesting. The other thing we know about in relation to sleep is that the blue light and also the EMFs that come off the device can deplete melatonin. And melatonin is super important for sleep onset and just sleep in general, but it's also a really important antioxidant that we need to support our immune system as well.
Melatonin's been around for billions of years, it's very important.
Yes,
definitely. That's great. It's a great point. Just one more thing about hormones. I think a lot of times, and you know this very well, is we'll be checking people for thyroid.
Or
thyroid.
Yeah.
So thyroid, in the conventional type of model, they might check more just like TSH or maybe TSH and free T4. We know that there's more of a picture, and we're going to probably talk about this at some future podcast. But how does thyroid affect energy?
Yeah, so typically low thyroid is what we see with patients who are fatigued.
Okay.
So not that they always have thyroid problems, but this is kind of the typical pattern if there is a thyroid issue. I feel like patients are pretty aware of this. A lot of people will come to me and say, I really want to check my thyroid. So what does that mean? That doesn't mean just looking at a TSH. So really looking at a full thyroid panel. TSH, free T4, your free T3, which is that active form of your thyroid hormone. Reverse T3, which can block the conversion to the active forms, and then antibodies. So is there any autoimmune process that could be going on? So it's the whole picture here that really allows us to know, is the thyroid optimal, and how can we target our treatment to best support the pathways that are going on?
So as you can see, as we're chatting here about fatigue, EJ, you've been really doing an amazing job of overviewing, all this for all of our listeners. There's so many different possible causes of fatigue. It's such a broad topic. How do you know where to begin, in terms of evaluating and then treating that?
Yeah, it's tough. So one thing I do like to ask patients and discuss with them is, when were you last well? Because a lot of patients can pick out a time when things may be shifted. So for example, say someone went on a camping trip and they came back with a bullseye rash, and that's when they knew that the fatigue started then. So maybe we start thinking Lyme disease infections, things like that. And I encourage patients to dig deep and really reflect back to, when were they last well? What shifts happened at that time? And you may be able to figure out for yourself, okay, this is what I was doing that kind of made that difference. So that's one of the first things. And then from there, the lifestyle, the gut, doing the lab workup. So that may include assessing the adrenals, thyroid, like we discussed, but also things like B12, your iron, your magnesium, those micronutrients that are so important to fuel the mitochondria.
And we've had Dr. Frame, who's a PhD at GW, talk about vitamin D.
Yes.
Tell us more about vitamin D and fatigue and how that kind of works.
Yeah, one thing I think is really important that some people don't realize too is that for the body to absorb magnesium, you need the vitamin D, which is so important.
Yes.
So many people are chronically vitamin D deficient. One, because of the sunlight exposure we talked about, we're just not outside enough. But vitamin D has so many impacts, and I've had patients who take vitamin D who it improves their sleep, which is amazing.
Yes.
So it's not just about immune function, but there are so many other aspects that it can support.
My understanding is that vitamin D helps, along with the B vitamins, to activate the sleep switches in your brain to basically get those switches online.
Yep.
That's great. Well, that's a great overview. I think that there are some other sort of not as common, but yet we do see them enough in our clinic. Just to mention as sort of an outline, I think, as you said, if someone has a bullseye rash and they're having joint pain, then that could be a Lyme issue.
Yeah.
How often do you see things like mold and toxins as causes of other symptoms, but also as part of that fatigue?
Yeah. So, and fatigue, I will say, sometimes there's not like that one magic bullet.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is the combination of all of these things, which is why we really have to think about all of.
So you're saying there could be more than one root cause?
There could be more than one root cause.
It doesn't have to be that simple. Wish it was sometimes.
I wish it was too, and I think patients wish the same thing, but sometimes it's just not that simple. But when it comes to infections, that's definitely one of those things that going back and assessing the history is really important. But Lyme is definitely one. Epstein-Barr is another really common infection that I see. A lot of people have either had previous mono infections that expose them to Epstein-Barr that can cause issues later on. And then to speak on toxins, that is definitely another huge topic. We are all exposed to toxins, and we all have some load of toxins in our body. The big thing is the total toxin load. So how much can your body handle? If our detox pathways are really working hard, it's going to be hard to supply energy to the rest of our body, to our brains, to our muscles, so that we feel good. So when it comes to detox and all these toxins, I definitely recommend, exploring your own home to see where some changes, where there are some changes that you could make. And there's some good apps out there to explore.
And then, get outside as well to
outside.
detox and get some fresh air.
Yes, good quality air out there. Yes.
Well, if you're looking for a practitioner that can really delve into the root causes of fatigue and do a great job with that, I think certainly talk more with EJ here.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
I would love to.
Thank you, EJ, so much. And just some closing questions that are very fun, for all of our guests here on the podcast. podcast. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Yes.
And let's talk about your morning routine, if you don't mind.
Yes, yeah. So I love this question because I used to have a great morning routine and then I got out of it, which I think happens. We have
absolutely.
something set and then we get out of it. But I did mention my cup of coffee, which is a little bit therapeutic for me. I think it's just that time where I get to sit and I don't have to think about anything else. I always start my day with a cup of water and then my cup of coffee, just to put that out there. Hydrate first.
Yes. Okay.
But that's something that stayed with me that has just been really meditative and relaxing
The
for
aroma
me.
of coffee. I just had some this morning.
Yes.
That mold-free coffee that we have.
Yeah.
It's great.
I'll never forget, waking up now, even with family around and just smelling the coffee, I'm like, okay.
Yes,
our
and it brings
time.
back good memories
Yes,
and endorphins and stuff. That's awesome. That's so great. And there's nothing like, the olfactory system, the smell system, and it just goes right to your brain and it activates a bunch of positive, chemicals and, neurotransmitters and things like that. Well, I know you love books and podcasts, so this might be a tough question, but what book or podcast are you enjoying the most right now?
I know. I was laughing when I read this question. I love reading books, so I recently joined Goodreads, which is an app. I don't know if you've heard of it before.
I've heard of it, yeah.
It's like a social media platform for book readers.
Cool.
It's great. So I have friends who follow me and they'll comment on oh, you're 50% done with this book. So it's really fun. And, you set goals for the year and things like that. I love to read anything. I recently read The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna.
Okay.
It's an amazing book. It's about it's set World War II and in France, and it's about two sisters who basically were part of the resistance there.
Was that a movie? I feel
It's coming out as a movie.
If it's not, it's definitely movie quality, right?
Yes, yeah.
That's awesome.
I saw that. But it was so good, and I think just to reflect back, we never want to forget our history, where we are today and what history has taught us.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Always learn lessons and kind of move forward.
Yep.
EJ, what do you do every day to cultivate joy? And we know that joy is one of the big root causes of wellness in terms of promoting that energy.
Yeah, definitely. Connecting with the people I love. Absolutely. Laughing with them. Dancing is one of my favorite. I love a good kitchen dance party. So just connecting with those people makes me feel grounded and like I could take on anything. Yeah,
well, that's so great. Thank you so much, EJ, for coming on today. And how can listeners learn more about you and work with you?
Yeah, so right through the Capital Integrative Health website, you can learn more about me and feel free to schedule with me.
Great. Thank you so much, EJ, for being on.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to us today. If you enjoyed this conversation, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps our podcast to reach more listeners. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next episodes and conversations. And thank you so much again for being with us.